Arc 5, Chapter 71, Sword Demon versus Former Sword Saint. The various battles across the span of the city were gradually meeting their end. The destruction caused in areas now altered into battlefields was immense, and the city's faculty had been greatly impacted. This very fact, which conveyed the extent of the catastrophe that had transpired in this city of Pristella, could be labelled as the result of the malice brought forth by the witch cult into the city. Within the situation of such devastation continuing to rise and be inflicted, there existed a single battlefield with a different hair colour. Rather, it might not even be appropriate to call it a battlefield. Only the solemn sound of swords clashing echoed, with each of the coruscating, swiping swords aiming for the other's life. Present here was only the tactless wish of two swordsmen, with the tips of their swords pointing towards each other, shredding everything unneeded for what could at least be said to be their true desire upon them. The swords' blades continued to gleam under the moonlight, and the swordsmen continued to exchange love over clashes of steel. Sharp retorts, scattering sparks, grey and red hair continued to dance under the rays of the moon. A swords dance so magnificent and polished, it would indisputably steal the sights of all audiences, or rob them of their hearts. It was such that even the sword god would ululate. The unimaginably lustrous movement of the longsword, as though blading through water. With a rebound, the twin swords swept through the breeze, striking the other like lightning. As though dancing a performance of reciprocated fixation, the swords of the two continued to intertwine with each other. Wilhelm accepted the sword slash of the one in front of him, of Teresia, still as beautiful as when she had been young, from the front, bathed in the sword slash with the same vigour, and mourned at the reaction he felt in his palm. Boiling up from the depths of his body was the acclamation of immature self's heart, despite his age. He was getting exhilarated. He was getting delighted. He was blooming. With honesty, must he affirm, the sword demon Wilhelm thought back to the days gone by, and yearned for a present where he could, once again, connect with his youthful wife. His heart had been scorched by that. His mind was now occupied by the thought, by how much he desired, and how he would willingly renounce everything, if it only meant for this exchange of swords, this tryst, to never come to an end.
But
such greed was blasphemy. It was unforgivable for him to even bear it. Blasphemy to the untiring days the sword demon Wilhelm had dedicated to the sword. Blasphemy to his oath of taking away the sword from the sword saint Teresia, once he put her to defeat. Blasphemy to his sentiments of utmost dedication to his master, as a swordsman. To detachedly follow the love that lit the chest of Wilhelm van Astrea would be blasphemy to everything that was living in this world at this very moment. Henceforth, he must not defer the cessation, regardless of how much these moments have proven to be a delightful paradise for the swords demon.
yeah!
A mute slash of the sword swept through like a storm, to which he responded with his own barrage of innumerable sword strikes. With long, deep red hair swaying, Teresia's movements clad in white clothes possessed no facilitation. Like a leaf afloat a stream, the lethal sword was fired from the interior of her completely natural stance. Up, down, left, right, her sword strikes had no particular angle. However, as the attacks overlapped, Wilhelm felt something to be slightly off. He likewise felt this conjunct discordance in her responses. Teresia van Astrea's ability as a swordsman was exceptional. Naturally, even when his body was at its prime, Wilhelm unmistakably failed to rival that territory in terms of pure swordsmanship. Even now, that prowess remained within Teresia's blade, as she stood in front of him, silent. The art of the sword saint to mercilessly kill adversaries, that invited both relief and envy onto guardians. However, her current self and herself of those days had a realm of decisive difference in between them.
Light.
As the twin sword and longsword collided face to face and sparks scattered around, the sword demon remarked. Locking swords, Wilhelm acutely stared into the blue eyes on the other side of his sword's blade.
Without even needing to compare, it is light, Teresia. Your sword, which rid itself of a hefty burden, is it something so light?
A certain tone, words mingled with disappointment, yet the eyebrows of her beautiful face let not even twitch. Teresia, with perfectly clear eyes, lacking all emotion, was returning a look to Wilhelm. No refutation, no revolt, they did not hold even enmity. She used to be a woman who used to often smile, often get angry, often sulk. She used to be a woman beautiful, like the blade when silent, but the times of her being silent were almost none. She used to be a woman, like a spherical flower, blooming under the sun. Thus her state now was naught but tragic. Present there was only the shell of his silent wife. As he exchanged slashes of swords with a figure he continued to love, Wilhelm's heart shattered into fragments. Prancing as if having returned to the days of the past, attenuating as if understanding the days of the past could not be returned to, casting aside the days of the past as if having a dream akin to a bubble on the surface. For 15 years, what kind of a life must Teresia have led? When he thought back to the time he had lost her and dedicated himself to vengeance, the incurable wound on Wilhelm's shoulder asserted itself. A wound inflicted by the divine protection of Death God would never disappear. It was a divine protection apart from the divine protection of the Sword Saint that had been bestowed upon Teresia by the Sword God in order to bring cease to those days of war. A single slit could generate a river of blood. A few slashes could pile up a mountain of corpses. Henceforth, there lay no necessity of superficial cleverness and artfulness for her in order to sever the thread of life. Indeed, the only way of defeating Teresia was through swordsmanship superior to that of hers. The Wilhelm of the past had shred himself to his extreme limits, which austerity that converted his own self into a sword. By persevering until the very end, he had truly managed to accomplish that. There was no way of defeating Teresia, who too got her abilities boosted to their very limit through the divine protection of the Sword Saint. And now, having exchanged swords with her useful self, Wilhelm understood. Her abilities with the sword were transcendent and lay in the territory of dexterity. However, there was one enormous shadow cast upon her swordsmanship.
Even if you felt troubled before holding the sword, you no longer felt troubled after holding it. You were a woman who knew that even better than myself. Do you remember the day we parted? At the occasion of the great subjugation, you shook me up as I stopped you, and inflicted an incurable wound upon this shoulder of mine. Your words back then, I have not forgotten a single one of them.
She gave no answer. He did not solicit one. This was simply Wilhelm's ceremony. Looking back onto that day, along with the pain of this shoulder, the memory etched within also resuscitated, while she commenced with the great subjugation, a journey she could potentially never return from. Teresia had verbatim let go of herself from Wilhelm, and had expressed, on the day of my return, please let me hear the words I could not hear.
I have come to fulfill that promise.
The twin swords roared, and Teresia's long sword strummed. The former Sword Saint swung the blade, utilising the recoil, but Wilhelm, without even looking at that counterattack, dodged by fully reading through its trajectory. He knew it. Where the blade was going to come from, so much so that he was in love with it.
Roar!
The habits were the same, the techniques were the same, scorched onto his soul, within the austerity of his former self. When he had shred himself, he had painted them in his mind. The sword techniques of the Sword Saint he was in pursuit of, defeating her, swearing to take it away from her. Reaching that territory, he yearned, and they were scorched onto his soul. It was the same, along with her figure, which warmed his chest. Even against Wilhelm's implore, the ravaging face of Rose did not flinch, even slightly, as the sword aimed for its prey soundlessly, silently, emotionlessly. Wilhelm shot it down altogether. He loved it so much that he knew it, even with his eyes closed. That was precisely why He now chose to love it without closing his eyes.
Yuck.
Above, counted the slash, exchanged swipes, raised the blade, slashed the sword diagonally, accepting the blade raining down upon him, and sinking the counter-attacking strike, dodging the swipe, then released, gyrating his body around the leaping point of the sword, both sides, who had slashed diagonally across each other's shoulders, then entwined their swords as the key performers, and shifted the counter-attack. Surpassing the blows with an elegant safeguard, impossibility arose in Teresia's swordsmanship. Teresia, who had acclimated to the blows, retreated, and Wilhelm plunged into that interval without any hesitation. For a single moment, emotion arose within Teresia's eyes, gazing at the sword demon. No, it was misapprehension. His effeminate heart had pulled out the memory of a situation of the past, identical to this one. Within the sights of abundant citizens, Wilhelm had struck and defeated the lead actor of the ceremony, the Sword Saint, and robbed the youth named Teresia from the Sword God. A facsimile of that situation, identical as this one. Then, the conclusion too would be identical once again.
Teresia. Haka!
Wilhelm attacked the long sword, flying towards her bosom. The sword demon hoisted up his twin sword against it, and unable to bear the pressure, there occurred a fissure in the blade. But, at the same time, the long sword repelled it by turning right overhead. Half of Teresia's body largely slackened. Drawing a wide semicircle, Wilhelm's twin sword made its return. Since the origin of this tryst, till this point, Teresia, who was right before his eyes, had produced the greatest gap thus far. With the muscles of his arms swelling up, he gripped the handle of the sword to the point it started creaking. And, wielding the attack with all his might, now he must put an end to this inconceivable reunion. He attempted to put an end to it.
Yeah.
Violent passion packed his throat, countless facial expressions levitating in his eyes. Her face when she was crying, her face when she was angry, her face when she was sulking, her face when she was smiling. Levitating were the beloved expressions of that same woman. Shaking that off entirely, Wilhelm shot down the blade, the sword slice bolted, running from the head to the torso of the woman. Before the slash could strike, a person's shadow emerged in the corner of Wilhelm's eyes. At the utmost limit of focus, it was a fluctuation in his concentration, originally impossible. However, that was all there was to it. Without any kind of influence, it was nothing beyond what he could simply ignore. As a swordsman, with his life on the line, he must cross swords at the border of life and death, and no bystanders could ever create any room of doubt in that. Devoting his everything to the being in front of his eyes, he fulfilled his purpose with a sword slash befitting of the sword demon. That was supposed to be what he was going to do. That was supposed to be what he could do. Had the shadow reflected, not being that of a person of red.
Father?
There was distance in between. The doubtful mutter was not at a distance where its echo could reach Wilhelm. Yet, he felt the voice as though it being whispered right into his ear. Looking towards him was a man with blue eyes and red hair. Heinkel Estrella was observing the final moments of this battle. Simply dazed at the conclusion of this deadly swordsmanship of his father, Wilhelm, and his mother, Teresia, as they aimed for each other's life. At that moment, the glint of his sword became dull. He was supposed to have fired a decisive strike, pouring himself into the trends of the fight, a sword strike that was supposed to bring an end to this long dream. The glint dulled, giving birth to a scope for counterattack. Teresia bent her body immensely, and reversing her wrist, the rebounding long sword rejected the twin sword away. The sound of the two blades colliding echoed, and she disarrayed down the strike that had promised to wound her, with her heart, technique, physique, and distance his purpose further away from fulfillment, her sparks scattered about. Why had he noticed? Receiving the blow of the sword fluttering in the wind, sidestepping its weight, Wilhelm clashed head-on with his emerging doubts with all his heart. Had he not noticed Heinkel's presence, or had he ignored his presence, had he kept focus on Teresia, he would not be in the unsightly shape he was in now. He had determined to dedicate his entire life and take Teresia away from the sword god. The result of that aggrandized decision. Did it have to be this predicament? Once again, commenced the successive notes of light sword strikes. However, the blade that had formerly turned transparent after the exchange of blows had already lost its sword stance. Foreign impurities had intermingled, using all kinds of strengths, of all possible limits, further enhancing the purity of the blade, had all been lost by the edge of the sword, which was supposed to have been swung only twice, due to a single appearance on the other side. All what remained was a solitary strike by the aged sword demon at his beloved wife, in front of their son. Without becoming a sword, without living as a sword demon, he was far too immature, far too deficient, as a father, as a husband, as a swordsman, as a man. Eventually, being rendered incapable of a single swing, he realised his immaturity. He was unable to stop foulness from intermingling with the essence of the swordsmanship pouring into the sword. Henceforth, this result may have been inevitable. Once the two blades were shot down, he then immediately jolted the longsword. Receiving the power of the sword strike with tactless asymmetrism, their strengths were being compared within the interval created by Teresia halting her legs. The moment he overcame the resistance and stepped ahead, the slender body in front of his eyes rotated, creating a gap. A leg appeared before him, halfway, and an interval was born. Immediately afterwards, premonition of demise shadowed him. He received the supremely mighty sword slash of indubitable coldness by gyrating his sword towards the rear with not even a millisecond of delay, without being able to stop the shattering attack. His own sword, that had accepted it, encroached deeply into his own shoulder, stepping as if on a foot below. His body, whilst bent forward, spouted blood. His bones creaked, his muscles palpitated, alighting in his brain. His right blade had accepted it. His left blade still remained. With blood cascading from the edge of his mouth, Wilhelm, using his right blade, as if carrying it on his shoulder, once again deflected Teresia's long sword upwards. Devoid of inaccuracy, Teresia's long sword was raised overhead. At the same time, the sword fell from Wilhelm's right hand. He did not mind. If his right hand was now free, he must dedicate all his strength into the remaining left blade and strike! With his left blade, he hammered a blow into Teresia. Behind him, carving a clockwise trajectory, a grim sword strike pierced up upright into Teresia. Sparks scattered, a sound echoed, a high-pitched report. The weight of the blade in his hand was halved, and Wilhelm, confronted with his own mistakes, having innumerably recognised his own weakness, once again took notice. The moment he struck Teresia with the attack, Wilhelm chose to act subconsciously. The blade gripped in his left hand. Should he strike it by rotating it towards the left or towards the right? A slight, meager difference. But at the same time, it marked a lethal difference for those two who had attained the pinnacle of swordsmanship. If he chose velocity left, or if he opted for strength right. After getting caught up in that choice, if he managed to realise he had erred in that action, things could still be helped. Wilhelm, whilst determining whether to look at Teresia straight ahead or not, in that single instant, lost his way. Accepting the sword demon's blow was a single swing released by Teresia's grip. Catching hold of it whilst it was mid-air, Teresia cut into the trajectory of the attack. The moment she accepted the sword and engaged it while standing still, she swung it down with immense force. This cracked the belly of Wilhelm's sword and rejected the steel, faced with no resistance. The Slon sword fragmented his sword, and Wilhelm perceived the loss of his special weapon. Instantly gripping to the handle of the fractured sword, he prepared for the following attack, which was in his instinct as a swordsman. However, that preparedness would bear fruit only if he differed in their purity as a swordsman. In that respect, herself, in front of his eyes, was the worst possible opponent. The sword demon who lost his sword, and the sword saint who was loved by the sword god. That difference was clear. No necessity for even delineating it. During the juncture, he forgot to even blink his eyes. Wilhelm saw the longsword pierce through his right leg. It was a sword so beautiful, to the extent he was charmed by it. The blade penetrated into the joint of the aged swordsman's right leg, and the edge of the sword was contaminated by minimal blood. Devoid of any unneeded destruction, right through the gap between muscle fibers and nerves, taking away only the functionality of the leg. It was the excellence of preeminent swordsmanship. The lack of resistance was such that it seemed as if the blade was simply swiping through water. With that performance being held upon his own right leg, Wilhelm's back shuddered. With his emotion that of admiration, vexation, infatuation, he himself did not know which one was best suited. What he did know was the only truth for his defeat being thrusted into his face. As the blade embedded into his right leg slid through, the height of his knees was divided. Just as when the Lord Sword had pierced in, his flesh drawn out soundlessly, Wilhelm groaned upon the delayed pain and crumbled. As blood flowed out of his leg's wound, his lower body was rendered powerless. If the power of the divine protection of Death God were to be invoked, despite what type of healing magic were used, it would not heal. The closer the distance with the will of the divine protection, the more of its effectivity increased. No matter how marginal the wound, it became a curse that eroded away life, and coerced endless bloodshed upon the victim. The wound on Wilhelm's right leg was not so slight as to be labelled a shallow wound. It was a gash that could be life-threatening if neglected, and the divine protection of Death God was obligated to refuse all recovery. It seemed as if the deadline for his life had been set for a period excessively short.
Regrettable.
As his brain was being scorched by the pain, he leaked out his grief prior to his anguish. The sense of pain was simulating an incessant screech, but Wilhelm revealed it on his face simply via furrowing his eyebrows and nothing more. He was not frivolously holding it back, or affixing it to his willpower. The sharp stimulus to his body could not possibly ever outstrip the darkness veiling his heart. When despair, despondency, and his own cowardliness and worthlessness was being scorched onto his soul, what significance could physical ache possibly hold for this aged swordsman? Dropping the sword in his hand, Wilhelm put his hand on the opening of the wound. The bleeding was supposed to leak away his life, but the defeated had no intention of disgracefully maintaining distance. However, according to etiquette, he must not meet his end by something like blood loss. He had fought as a swordsman. He had opposed as a swordsman. He had been defeated as a swordsman. Then, the life of the defeated was to be taken away by the sword of the victor.
Teresia, I am...
The female swordsman arose, with her long sword being carried on her shoulder, was gazing down towards Wilhelm. In those eyes, truly, existed no deep emotion. Without remembering anything until the very end, and continuing to not remember anything, she was the death god of the sword, who was going to reap Wilhelm's life. He looked up at the beautiful face, such that he was fascinated by it. Teresia, silent, swung the sword before Wilhelm. Once her sword descended, Wilhelm's life too would come to an end, but...
alone. Never will I.
The instant of the longsword's descent, Wilhelm extended his right hand. Lying there was a fragment of the twin swords, the sword Teresia had cast aside. Wilhelm picked it up with his fingers and floundered, unable to accept the moment of his death, till the end of the end. His defeat, that remained unchanged. That could not be helped. But, in these moments, he must not render Teresia, her, alone. Unable to stop his wife, who was being made to swing the sword against her will, he could not allow her to advance towards Krush, who he was greatly indebted to, or to Subaru and the rest. If his life being burnt away was insufficient, then he did not mind the destruction of his soul after death. However, the brandish of that resolution was...
Teresia.
Keeping her sword held tight, Teresia leapt a great distance backwards. She was a distance that the swipe of the blade he held in his right hand would not reach her, at a position that would be beyond Wilhelm's reach, whose leg had been injured. Teresia slightly inclined her neck. Her motionless eyes, seeing a terribly empty colour in them, Wilhelm, for the first time, experienced fright. That fear was a fear that arose in his instinct, in Wilhelm's instincts as a swordsman. There lay no necessity to go out of the way and deliver a finishing blow to a prey bearing fatal injuries. With the pride of a swordsman long lost, this was the judgment which could only be cast by a calm god of death.
Wait. Teresia.
Wilhelm shouted at the dread of being left behind. His leg did not hurt. Forgetting the ache of his right leg, Wilhelm tried to pursue the distant Teresia. However, the pain, or at the very least the wound, was real. Without any strength, he tumbled. Potently striking his shoulder, the aged swordsman made an expression conveying how unforgivable this was. Swinging about her long red hair, Teresia became further distant. Ahead of the path of her footsteps was Heinkel, standing upright. The longsword, with no decline in fighting spirit thus far, established him as its next prey. Slashing the man whom she did not know was her husband, she would next slash the man who she did not know was her son. For that purpose...
Stop, Teresia. Do you think that is forgivable? Fight me. Look at me. At me. Look at me. At me, Teresia.
With a voice as though bleeding, Wilhelm called Teresia. Innumerable times that name which he wished to call whilst having her in his eyes, in a form utterly unlike the figure he had thought of. Innumerable times. Rage in lieu of love, insanity in lieu of passion, devoting it all. However, the woman did not look back. Gripping firmly the sword in which the god of death took abode, the woman slowly resumed heading towards Heinkel. Heinkel inhaled at that figure advancing ahead, and unsheathed the knight's sword with his own trembling hands.
Wait! I said wait! Teresia, he said. No way. It can't be possible. It can't be, Mother! No, even if it isn't Mother. It's not it. Father had become like that, so... Shit! What is this? Just, what is this? What are you doing?
Looming before his eyes was Teresia of her youthful days. That form, and the form of her as a mother within Heinkel, did not overlap. He shook his neck horizontally in repudiation, and desperately tried to deny the spectacle before his eyes, voicing words he failed to put a halt to. His knees sneered, his line of sight disarrayed, and his figure, whilst wielding the sword too, seemed frail. Faced with the former Sword Saint, he possessed not even the slightest of chance. At this rate, unquestionably, Heinkel would be slashed to death by Teresia. That alone was something which could never be allowed to happen.
Teresia, over here. I am still alive. If you want to kill, then kill me first. Heinkel, there is no way you can do it. Right. This instant, flee.
Supporting himself with the sword, Wilhelm stood up, feeling as though he was crunching stones. With no room for grasping his wound, with an increase in pressure, further of his own blood gushed out. A cascade of fresh blood. The cobblestone subsequently became dyed in a hue of red, and whilst pulling the thread of that blood, Wilhelm pursued Teresia's back. Distant. Too distant. Slow. Too slow. Once again, Wilhelm would not make it. Once again, Wilhelm could not reach it. Teresia's longsword drew an arc, and the knight's sword of Heinkel, who had tugged his shoulders inward, accepted it. With not even the slightest stagnation, Heinkel's knight's sword left his hands far too quickly, giving rise to a shrill note as it bounced on the cobblestone.
Stop. Please, stop, Mom!
Rendered unarmed, the frightened Heinkel fell on his bottom at that spot. Flailing around his limbs desperately, Heinkel tried to escape as if crawling. However, his quivering fingers, his terrified heart, and Teresia's eyes devoid of emotion tethered his mind and body to fear, and he was rendered nearly perfectly immobile at that very spot. His throat was parched. Wiping off the tremendous cold sweat he was perspiring, Heinkel made a pallid face. There had possibly been some incontinence there as well. However, robbed of the composure to even feel embarrassed about that, Heinkel stared at the tip of the longsword hoisted upward, as though slicing the moon. The longsword extended directly towards the heavens. At the brink of his life, Wilhelm could accomplish naught but witness the spectacle of his wife slash their son to his death, in front of his eyes. He raised his voice. It did not reach. He stretched his hand. It did not reach!
Teresia!
No strength remained in the merely hollering words of the sword demon, who had been unable to dedicate his everything into the sword. Heartlessly, the longsword was swung to cut off Heinkel's life.
That will be as far as you go.
That voice, suddenly, but distinctly, cut into the seamlessly stinging tension. With a dignified tone, and not a single fragment of facilitation in it, it wielded no pardon. Those who heard it were struck with the awe of an overwhelming existence. It was simply natural to abide by its will. Wilhelm, Heinkel, and even Teresia halted all movement. Ahead of the line of the sight of the three stood a single youth, blazing red hair, like fire, perfectly clear, gleaming blue eyes, which captured the blue sky. Even with his white outfit contaminated by blood and mud, the figure standing upright was needless of any words to be adorned with except for heroic. The youth steadily continued to advance towards the location. In his hands were a scabbard with the engraving of deep scratches, and a knight's sword unsheathed from side scabbard. A sword blade polished to the extent of aberration, he clutched the dragon sword reed. The voice of the laughter of the sword god resonated raucously in the ears of the sword demon.